The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sleek office building, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. At the grand corner desk sat CEO Isabella Grey, a woman known for her ruthless drive and unshakable confidence. She had conquered the business world with sharp intellect and an iron will. But there was something missing, a void she couldn't fill with money or success. One afternoon she sat at a local park bench, her usual refuge from the relentless world of boardrooms and numbers. As she observed the world go by, she noticed him. A single dad, his wrinkled shirt and worn-out jeans a stark contrast to the polished suits of the corporate world. He was setting up a chessboard on the bench, his small daughter sitting nearby watching with wide eyes. Curiosity piqued, Isabella, known for her sharp mind and penchant for challenges, approached him. "I've always been told I'm quite the chess player," she said, her voice oozing confidence. "How about a game? If you beat me, I'll marry you." Her words, dripping with arrogance, made the onlookers chuckle. But the single dad didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled politely and accepted the challenge, his eyes betraying none of the shock Isabella expected. And as the game unfolded, the CEO couldn't help but wonder, what kind of man was this? A humble father with no interest in her wealth or status, yet seemingly unfazed by the stakes. As she tried to predict his moves, she realized she couldn't read him. His calm demeanor was unlike anything she had ever encountered. What made him accept such a ridiculous challenge without hesitation? What lay beneath the surface of this quiet man? The game had only just begun, but already, Isabella knew that she had underestimated him. And soon she would learn that the single dad's response would leave her stunned, not by arrogance or anger, but by something much more powerful, quiet strength. Isabella Grey was a woman who had built an empire with sheer willpower. Her name alone struck fear into competitors, while her business card could open doors that others could only dream of. She had everything: money, power, and prestige, but at a steep cost. In her world, emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford. The stakes were always high, the deals always cutthroat, and in a world ruled by ruthless ambition, there was no room for weakness. Isabella's success was undeniable, but beneath her polished exterior was a woman who rarely, if ever, allowed herself to be vulnerable. Her life revolved around spreadsheets, deadlines, and board meetings, where cold logic and sharp decisions were paramount. But the truth was, Isabella had no real friends, no true connections beyond her professional network. She lived for the adrenaline of the chase, the rush of sealing deals, and the respect that came with being a formidable CEO. Yet, despite all her achievements, something was missing, a sense of fulfillment, a connection that went beyond the surface. Then there was him, the single dad. Chris Thompson was the polar opposite of Isabella. He lived a quiet life, his world centered around his daughter, Sophie. With worn hands and a heart full of love, Chris had never let the world's judgment change his core. He was a humble man, balancing a modest job with the care of his young daughter, working tirelessly to provide for her while fostering a deep bond built on trust and affection. Unlike Isabella, Chris found solace in the simplicity of life. His passions weren't wrapped in wealth or accolades, they were found in the small moments, the quiet victories. His love for chess wasn't just a hobby, it was a way to connect with his late father and pass the time with Sophie in the evenings. To him, the chessboard was more than just a game, it was a sanctuary from the chaos of the world, a place where each move held a deeper meaning. The worlds of Isabella and Chris could not have been more different. One was a world of unyielding ambition, where power was the ultimate goal, and the other was a world grounded in love, patience, and modesty. Isabella's days were spent in high-rise offices, negotiating multimillion-dollar deals, while Chris's days revolved around school runs and quiet evenings spent in the park with Sophie, teaching her the strategies of chess. It was in this very park, away from the high-stakes pressures of business, that their worlds collided. Isabella, with her trademark confidence, walked through the park one afternoon, seeking a brief escape from the endless demands of her empire. That's when she saw him, Chris, setting up his chessboard on a bench. Her gaze lingered on him. There was something about the simplicity of his life that intrigued her. The way he moved with quiet precision, the way he focused on the game as if it were the most important thing in the world. And there, in that moment, a challenge was born. Isabella was certain she could win. After all, she was used to winning at everything she did. But something about Chris's calm presence made her question if this would be as easy as she thought. What was driving her to make such a bold bet? Was it the thrill of the game, the desire to prove herself once again, or something deeper, an unspoken curiosity about this quiet, humble man who seemed so different from the world she knew? As the game began, Isabella realized that this wouldn't be just another challenge, It was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. Isabella Grey's footsteps echoed confidently against the cobbled path as she strolled through the park, her mind already moving on to the next big deal. Her sharp, observant eyes scanned the surroundings, catching sight of a small family playing nearby, children laughing, a couple holding hands, simple, peaceful moments she rarely allowed herself to savor. She was always too focused on her next goal, her next win. But something about the park's tranquility was appealing today. She needed a brief break from the high-stakes world that constantly buzzed in her mind. Her gaze soon fell upon Chris Thompson, sitting on a bench, a chessboard spread out before him. His focus was entirely on the game in front of him, his fingers carefully placing a piece. A soft breeze tugged at his shirt, but he didn't seem to notice. Beside him, his young daughter Sophie watched with wide eyes, her little hands folded in her lap. It was an image of calm, the complete opposite of the high-energy world Isabella inhabited. She couldn't help but feel a little intrigued. Isabella's lips curled into a half-smile as she walked over, her heels clicking against the pavement. She stopped in front of the bench, her presence immediately noticed by Chris, who looked up from the board with a polite smile. "I don't suppose you're any good at chess?" Isabella asked, her tone dripping with playful arrogance. Chris raised an eyebrow, his eyes shifting from the board to meet hers. "I play for fun," he said quietly, his voice warm but steady. "But I'm no grandmaster." Isabella's smile widened as if she'd expected this answer. She loved a good challenge, especially when it was easy. "Good," she said, sitting down across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Because I'm very good. In fact, I'm quite unbeatable." Chris glanced at her for a moment, a flicker of amusement in his eyes, but he said nothing. Isabella took this as her cue to dive into her favorite kind of game, the verbal one. "You know," she continued, "it's funny how often people like you underestimate me. I've seen it time and time again. They think because I'm a woman or because I'm a CEO, I'm just all business." She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering with a confident edge. "But I'm full of surprises." Chris's expression remained neutral, but he could feel the weight of her words. The arrogance wasn't lost on him. He had seen it before, people with everything to prove, yet always searching for validation. He didn't share her need to dominate every situation. Chess, for him, was a game of peace, a way to unwind, not to compete in the way she seemed to relish. "I don't mind surprises," he said, his fingers moving a pawn forward, eyes back on the game. "All right," Isabella said, leaning back with a chuckle. "Here's my challenge. Beat me in chess and I'll marry you." She said it as a joke, something she was certain would earn a laugh or at least a scoff. She had tossed out the words carelessly, testing the waters with the same level of confidence she used in her business dealings. She expected him to laugh it off, maybe even politely refuse. But instead there was a brief silence. Chris didn't laugh. He looked up at her, his gaze steady. There was no arrogance, no mockery in his eyes, only quiet acceptance. "All right," he said simply, nodding slightly. "Let's play." Isabella stared at him for a long moment, taken aback. She wasn't used to being met with such calmness in the face of her challenges. Was he really serious? She couldn't tell whether this was the confidence of someone who thought they could actually beat her or just the indifference of a man who wasn't intimidated by her at all. But either way he was playing. She was used to winning every challenge, every competition. But in this moment she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this man, this humble, quiet father, was different. Was he a chess genius, waiting for the perfect moment to stun her with his brilliance? Or was this just a random bet, one she was sure to win? Either way she was determined to finish what she had started. But as the first piece was moved, Isabella couldn't help but feel a sense of unease stirring inside her. There was something about this challenge that felt different. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park as the chess pieces clicked into place. Chris moved his knight, a steady and calculated motion, his eyes narrowing with quiet concentration. The game had begun, and with each passing second, Isabella could feel the weight of her own impatience creeping in. She wasn't used to waiting, especially not in a game. Yet, as she watched Chris's calm movements, something inside her stirred. The pieces were simple, carved wood, nothing extravagant, but to Chris they were far more than that. Every piece represented a memory, a strategy, a moment of peace he hadn't had since Sophie's mother had left. He wasn't playing for pride. He wasn't playing for anyone else's approval. He played for himself, for his daughter, and for the moments of quiet victory that only chess could give him. He leaned in, his fingers lightly brushing the pawn in front of him before making a small, deliberate move. It was subtle, but it mattered. His strategy was unfolding. It wasn't about taking pieces quickly, it was about positioning, creating a web of moves that would slowly suffocate the opponent. He had learned this long ago from his father, who had passed away years before Sophie was born. The game had always been their bond. It was something they had shared, a quiet understanding passed from father to son. Now it was something he shared with Sophie. "Can I move it like this, Daddy?" Sophie asked from the side, watching intently as her father played. Chris looked over at her, smiling softly. "You're doing great. Just remember patience. It's not always about rushing to the end. It's about thinking ahead." The words came naturally to him, and they had become part of their evening ritual, after dinner, after Sophie's homework, after everything else had settled down. Chess wasn't just a game to him. It was his escape, his time to focus, to drown out the world's noise. And in this small, peaceful park, with Sophie beside him, he was exactly where he wanted to be. Isabella, however, was having a different experience. Her thoughts buzzed with the kind of restlessness she was all too familiar with. As Chris made his next move, she caught herself tapping her fingers on the table, a subtle sign of her growing impatience. She had always been quick to act, fast with her decisions, confident in her ability to outthink and outmaneuver others. Yet here, across the board from this quiet man, she found herself struggling to read him. His moves were simple, but there was a depth in them she couldn't immediately grasp. And it irritated her. She glanced at her watch. 10 minutes had passed and she hadn't even captured a single piece. The game should have been over by now. She was the CEO of a multimillion-dollar company. She didn't lose games. She didn't waste time. But this man, this single dad, was making her rethink her approach. It wasn't just about the game, it was about him. A faint memory tugged at her. As a child, she had always been told to be more, to do more. She was never allowed to show weakness, never allowed to be anything less than perfect. Her mother, a stern, unyielding woman, had pushed her relentlessly, molding her into the tough, driven businesswoman she was today. But it had come at a cost. She had always been alone, chasing success but never finding true happiness. Was this man, this father, somehow more content than she could ever be? Was his simplicity, his calm demeanor, something she had been missing all her life? "Make your move, Miss Grey," Chris's voice cut through her thoughts, pulling her back to the board. She blinked and refocused, irritated that her concentration had slipped. She quickly moved her queen, hoping to reassert control. But Chris didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted his pieces slowly, his moves deliberate, thoughtful. There was no rush. He didn't need to win in a hurry. He wasn't playing for a paycheck, for a promotion, or for validation. He was playing for something else. As she observed him, Isabella's mind drifted again, this time to the pressure she had felt as a young woman climbing the corporate ladder. The business world had never been kind to women. She had learned early that if you didn't prove yourself, you'd be left behind. She had become tough, maybe too tough, not just to survive but to dominate. Every challenge was a battle, and every win, a victory over the doubts she had carried since childhood. But now, with each quiet move Chris made, she began to question herself. His calmness, his confidence in the simplicity of his life, was something she could never have imagined for herself. And yet, there was something magnetic about it. Something she longed for but couldn't quite grasp. Her mind flicked back to the game. She had underestimated him, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella Grey wasn't sure if she could win. The chessboard had become a battleground, each piece a soldier in a game that had gone far beyond simple strategy. Isabella's mind raced, her pulse quickening as she studied the board. It was supposed to be simple, a victory for her in a game she had long dominated. But now she felt something unfamiliar, a slight tremor of doubt. Chris had moved steadily, methodically, with a quiet grace that had made her uncomfortable from the beginning. Each of his moves seemed calculated, not in the way of a grandmaster, but in the way of someone who understood far more than just the game itself. And now, as she glanced over at the board again, it hit her. She was losing. Her queen was trapped in a corner, vulnerable, surrounded by his knights and pawns, each of them closing in like a well-oiled machine. She had made a rash move earlier, a mistake in her arrogance, and now it was costing her. She had thought she could outplay him, win with ease. But Chris wasn't playing to impress. He wasn't playing for the high stakes of her world, he was playing because it was meaningful to him. And it showed. Isabella's breath caught in her throat, a flicker of vulnerability flashing across her face. For the first time in years she wasn't in control. For the first time in years she wasn't winning. The realization was sharp, like a slap to the face, and she couldn't help but feel a crack in the perfect armor she'd so carefully crafted. She was used to being the one who outsmarted others, the one who always knew what to do when to do it. But here, across from this humble man, all of her calculated moves, all of her bravado seemed meaningless. Her fingers hovered above her next move, but her thoughts were a blur. She glanced at Chris, his calm expression unwavering. He had been so quiet, so steady. What was his story? How had he come to be so different from the men in her world, so unlike the people who fought for every inch of power? Her ego rose up to defend itself, pushing away the discomfort that crept into her chest. She couldn't be losing, not to him. Not like this. But as her eyes darted around the board, trying to find a way out, Chris made his next move. It was unexpected, a quiet, confident shift that made Isabella's heart skip a beat. His bishop moved diagonally, crossing her carefully constructed defenses, and suddenly she saw it. The brilliance in his move. A check. A real, undeniable check. The game had shifted, and Isabella found herself cornered. Her queen was no longer the invincible piece she had once thought it to be. She felt her chest tighten as she leaned forward, trying to decipher a way to recover, but the more she looked, the more hopeless it seemed. She was trapped, outplayed, and for the first time in a long time she didn't have an answer. Chris's calm eyes met hers across the board. No smug satisfaction, no words of triumph. Just a simple, steady gaze that seemed to say, "I'm here, and this is the game we're playing." For a brief, fleeting moment, Isabella was struck by something deeper than the game. She felt a shift in herself. Her arrogance, her pride, the need to always be the one in control. She began to question it all. Why did she always feel the need to dominate? What had it cost her to build this wall of perfection around herself? How much had she lost along the way? A strange vulnerability washed over her, as if the very foundation she had built her identity on was beginning to crack. Was this loss just a game, or was it a symbol of something larger, of the parts of herself she had buried deep down, the parts that had long been overshadowed by her ambition? Her thoughts flickered back to her childhood. The relentless pressure from her mother to be the best, to win, to never show weakness. She had taken those lessons to heart, building her entire life on them, only to realize now that in her pursuit of perfection, she had distanced herself from everything else: real connection, humility, the simple joy of being human. She looked at Chris again, this time seeing him not just as an opponent, but as a reflection of everything she had missed. He wasn't playing to prove anything. He wasn't seeking glory, just the satisfaction of knowing he had played the game with honor, with intention. And in that moment she understood something she hadn't before. It wasn't about winning. It was about how you played. She glanced at the board again, her eyes drawn to the way he had positioned his pieces, simple, methodical, but powerful. The moves had a depth to them that she hadn't anticipated, a quiet genius beneath the surface. And that's when it hit her. He wasn't just a chess player. He was a man who had learned to embrace the quiet strength that came with humility. Chris, on the other hand, felt a deep sense of peace as he watched her wrestle with the game. He had no illusion of grandeur, no need to impress. This wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about winning or losing in the traditional sense. For him, chess was just the way he connected with life, with the moments that mattered most, the time spent with Sophie, the small victories that weren't measured in material gain, but in the quiet moments of understanding. But as the game neared its end, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From a young man trying to survive on his own to a father who had built a life with his daughter, he had learned that strength didn't come from winning every battle. It came from being present, being true to yourself, and knowing when to let go. The game was winding down. The pieces were in place for the final move. And in that moment, both of them, in their own ways, began to understand something they hadn't before. It wasn't about who won or lost. It was about what they had learned from each other along the way. The game reached its final moments. Chris made his last move, placing his knight in a way that trapped Isabella's king, effectively ending the game. She stared at the board in disbelief, the realization sinking in that she had lost. But what shocked her more wasn't the loss, it was the way Chris responded. He didn't gloat, didn't smile smugly or make any victory remarks. There was no sense of triumph in his demeanor, no hint of pride. He simply leaned back, his calm eyes meeting hers. Isabella was still processing the shock of defeat when Chris spoke softly. "You've got a lot of power, Isabella. But what do you really want out of all this? You're not a game, you know. Neither am I. We're both chasing something. Maybe it's time you stopped running and figured out what truly matters." For a moment, Isabella was speechless. She had thought the game was about proving her superiority, about winning for the sake of it. But Chris wasn't interested in the bet at all. He had never been playing for her to lose. He had been playing to make her see the truth. And in that quiet moment, the realization hit her. the game wasn't about winning at all. It was about understanding. And it was Chris, not her, who had truly won. In the stillness of the moment, Chris's quiet strength became more evident than ever. He didn't need to exploit Isabella's vulnerability, instead he chose to help her face it. His humility, his understanding, was a stark contrast to the external bravado she had spent years building. Isabella, for the first time, felt the weight of her success, the emptiness, the loneliness she had been running from. Her achievements had never filled the void. She had always measured her worth by the victories she claimed in the business world, but now, as she faced Chris, she realized what truly mattered. With a deep, sincere breath, Isabella looked him in the eye. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "You've shown me something I've been missing for years." She paused, her next words full of humility. "I want to offer you something. Not because you won, but because I respect you." This time the offer wasn't about a bet, it was about a chance to grow, to transform. As Isabella stood, a new sense of purpose filled her. She no longer craved the fleeting power of winning at all costs. Instead, she realized that her true strength lay in personal growth, in embracing humility and vulnerability. She chose a different path, one focused on self-awareness and meaningful connections, rather than corporate conquest. Chris and Sophie left the park, not with trophies or accolades, but with a quiet victory, one that came from staying true to their values. In the end, the story reminded them all, true power isn't in dominance, but in humility, emotional intelligence, and the courage to change. The game was never about chess, it was about understanding. True strength, as Chris showed, lies not in ego or control, but in humility, emotional clarity, and respect for others. The willingness to face one's vulnerabilities and embrace change is what leads to real transformation. Isabella's journey from pride to self-awareness mirrors the truth that redemption is found when we stop running from ourselves and open our hearts to growth. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't the win on the board, it was the transformation of two people learning to see each other, not as opponents but as equals. What would you have done if you were in Isabella's shoes? How would you have handled the challenge? We'd love to hear your thoughts on the story, whether you've experienced a similar moment of self-reflection or transformation. Have you ever been in a situation where humility changed your perspective? Or perhaps you've learned a powerful lesson from a moment of vulnerability? Share your personal stories with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of growth, redemption, and the power of emotional intelligence. Your story could inspire someone else to change their path.